So welcome everyone to this community conversation about the future of transportation in West Sacramento. This virtual outreach event is the first in a series of events that will be occurring over the coming months as part of the city's development of a mobility action plan, or MAP. Next slide, please, Christina. We have a few speakers who are going to be leading the discussion today that I'd like to introduce first. We're honored to have Councilmember Chris Ledesma here with us to help kick off the presentation and set the stage for why we're doing this work. And then next up will be me. My name is Sarah Strand. I'm a senior transportation planner with the city and I'm managing the development of the Mobility Action Plan. And last but not least, Christina Svenk, the project lead from our supporting consultant team, is also going to be facilitating a portion of this discussion. In terms of what to expect from today's event, in a moment, I'll be passing things off to Councilmember Ledesma to provide some opening remarks. And from there, we'll present some information about the map, and then we'll ask to hear from you through a series of pop-up polling questions. The purpose of this first virtual event is really to introduce this project to you all and to initiate a conversation about what the future of mobility could look like in West Sacramento. We hope that you're excited by some of the concepts that we present to you today and see this as a starting point to share your ideas and feedback through future surveys and events that we're going to be sharing some more information about. We'll end with an open Q&A, but do please feel free to enter any questions you have along the way into the question box using your GoToWebinar dashboard at any point during the presentation. And so now I'm very excited to pass it over to Councilmember Chris Ledesma to kick off the conversation. Councilmember Ledesma has been a longtime proponent of growing transportation options in West Sacramento, and he's also served as a commissioner on the Mayor's Commission on Climate Change since 2018. So I'm very excited he's here to help set the table for this conversation and provide some broader context before we dive in. So without further ado, Councilmember Ledesma.
Thank you, Sarah, and good afternoon, everyone. I hope everyone that's took time to join the call today is doing well. I hope you're all staying healthy and well, you and your families, and certainly want to thank you for taking the time today to be a part of this exciting call. It really is a launch pad of a conversation with our community about where we're going with mobility and transportation. I think many of you have I'm glad you have an interest in transportation and mobility. I think many of you have seen some of the work we've done either through our work on VIA or the work on the shared bikes and scooters to increase walkways, bikeways that we're all using and probably using more so than ever today. But today is all around getting your input, introducing you some new concepts. And it's become a bit different today as because of this pandemic, which we're hopefully all getting through okay. It's certainly changed a little bit about the way we're working, the way we're getting around and where we're going and our ability to do so. But there'll be a time when we need transit, when we will need transit back in full force. And I don't want to set the stage for how we can just get back to a normal. I want to think about what's the next normal, getting back to something new that we can all use, that community members from all over our neighborhoods that have a need for transit to get to work, to go shopping, to get to where they need to go to visit a family member, or to just to get around. How do we do that going forward? And the city's been working a long time to improve, expand our transportation options to make it a better future for all of us. So think about the time in West Sacramento where you can travel around, do so in a way that's environmentally conscious, and more so it's convenient. You can get from one space to another, from wherever you are in the city to another part of the city or another part of the region for that matter, whether it's biking, walking, sharing a ride, or choosing an electrified vehicle. Those are things we should be thinking about and planning for, and that's what today is for. So hopefully you come with some good ideas. Hopefully you've had some experiences to the things we've worked on. So things like again, like I said, the VIA, the West Sacramento On Demand service, which we started, as well as the jump bikes, or whatever else you thought of or seen in other experience in other cities. Those are things to bring to the table. We're serious about it. It may seem odd that we're thinking about this in the middle of a pandemic, but it's my belief this is the time you absolutely do think about these things. We got to keep working towards bettering our community, making sure there's opportunities for everybody to get around in a safe and efficient way. So think about the ideas you have. Again, use the questionnaires, follow Sarah's instructions that either enter your questions into the question box or at the end, and don't be shy. And again, this is the launch pad of our conversation. So should you have more feedback, certainly I'd welcome them. I'm sure Sarah would after this is over. And again, we'll all work together to make sure we have a good process going forward and have a good session today. So I want to thank you. Thanks, Sarah, for organizing this. I look forward to the conversation.
All right, thank you so much, Councilmember Ledesma. As Councilmember Ledesma mentioned, can you go back, Christina? The current pandemic, it has impacted how people get around, and we do realize it might seem like a little bit of a strange time to be asking about your transportation preferences. But as you mentioned, this is also a big opportunity for us to consider how we might preserve some of the good that has been emerging from this period of time. For example, the increases in active transportation. We've seen tons of people out on the Clarksburg Branch Line Trail or the Sycamore Trail biking and walking. And as a result, we've also seen a lot less traffic and less air pollution. So we're really hoping that you'll join us in envisioning how we can come out of this even better than before as the city continues to plan for a sustainable and healthy mobility network for West Sacramento. So what exactly is the Mobility Action Plan, or the MAP, and where did it come from? In 2016, the City Council directed staff to conduct some research and develop a public transportation strategy that would explore some new ideas and technologies to make it easier for residents to use public transit. And this direction was coming amidst climbing costs of bus service and declining ridership, especially in some of our more spread out parts of town like Southport. New mobility providers like Uber and Lyft had also become widely adopted, and we're starting to show how technology can really disrupt the transportation industry. The City Council was committed to ensuring that staff was leveraging new ideas and technologies to develop a robust mobility system for West Sacramentans that provides ample choices in how folks get around. And so from these original conversations, City Council ultimately approved changes to the local bus service to improve connections downtown, the creation of the city's on-demand rideshare program with VIA, and helped lead the regional deployment of bike share and scooter share. And the transportation industry has been evolving at an incredibly rapid rate. And so it was apparent that a plan was needed to help the city get ahead of the curve and prepare for these new mobility options and technologies of the future. And this work has become increasingly important through the lens of addressing climate change, with almost half of our state's emissions contributing to global warming coming from the transportation sector. The city has been committed to making it easier for community members to choose sustainable ways of getting around. In 2018, Mayor Cabalden joined forces with the City of Sacramento's Mayor Steinberg to commit to the very bold goal of reaching carbon zero in West Sacramento by the year 2045. And our Councilmember Ledesma also served as a commissioner on that effort. So in alignment with the mayor's Climate Commission goals, the city is also in the process of developing a climate action plan that will identify a range of strategies for how we reduce local emissions, ranging from land use to solid waste, and to include transportation and social equity. But in order to reach carbon neutrality by 2045, the city must be very strategic about how we invest in our local mobility network. So the Mobility Action Plan will directly support the Climate Action Plan and will help the city to identify steps we can take in the realm of transportation to help reach these ambitious goals. Next slide. The Mayor's Commission on Climate Change identified 3 areas of concentration within the mobility sector which we're using as a high-level framework for this mobility action plan. It includes active transportation, which includes things like walking or using a wheelchair, riding a personal or shared bike or scooter, skateboarding, or other human-powered forms of mobility that have no or low emissions. Transit and shared mobility, which can include riding the bus, but also extends to things like via rideshare or SAC-RT's Smart Ride microtransit program, light rail, car share, or even carpooling. Basically, just options that reduce emissions when people choose to share a ride instead of driving alone. And last but not least, zero emission vehicles, which includes plug-in and battery electric vehicles, as well as hydrogen fuel cell vehicles that reduce emissions by using cleaner fuels. And applications of zero emission vehicles can range from personal auto use to city fleet operations to local bus or rideshare services, or even electric assist bikes and scooters. These goals will serve as a framework for the map, but we also know that there may be other ideas from the community about what types of new modes and technologies can help us to develop a more sustainable mobility system that works for everyone, which is why we're here today. Next slide. We also know that we're not starting from scratch here. So the city has put significant work into planning for a robust mobility network in the past, including the mobility element of the city's general plan, development of safe routes to school recommendations across the city, the 2018 update of the bicycle, pedestrian, and trails master plan, alongside the mayor's climate commission report that was recently adopted. The mobility action plan is going to be building on these efforts, and it won't be trying to reinvent the wheel. However, while it's critical for the city to plan for the future of transportation, we'll also be working to look back on where we've been and consider if there might be any gaps in our existing plans or policies, some of which were developed before many of today's new mobility options and technologies really even existed. The mobility action plan will also be coordinated with ongoing projects that are aligned with these goals, including the forthcoming climate action plan, the plug-in partnership, which will be working to deploy more EV charging stations throughout the city in the coming year, as well as long-standing transit planning efforts that are being coordinated with other agencies. And this includes changes that may be coming to our local bus network based off of recommendations that YOLO Bus has been developing with community feedback over the course of the past year to improve things like bus frequencies and connections for West Sacramento and the district at large, really. And city staff has also continues to coordinate with the city of Sacramento on a downtown riverfront streetcar that would create a reliable connection between the two cities. Next slide, please. However, today, we'd like to hone in our conversation to really focus on the key components of the mobility action plan. And the primary goal of this effort will be to help guide the city's local investments in the transportation network to ensure that residents have sustainable choices in how they get around, both today and well into the future. And this means exploring other options so that residents don't feel like driving is the only way to get around, as well as better understanding what barriers are preventing folks from making the choice to leave the car at home more often, and investing in services and infrastructure that make it easier or even more preferable for residents to choose active, shared, or electric options more often in the future. And big picture, transportation is just about more than moving people from point A to point B. It's really about providing West Sacramentans with a high quality of life, regardless of their age, ability, or income, by making it easy to reach daily needs like work, school, medical appointments, as well as recreation and things like parks or trails or local shops and restaurants. So the mobility action plan will be focused on three main categories of recommendations: streamlined transit, multimodal mobility hubs, and emerging trends and technologies. Next slide, please. So when we talk about streamlined transit, we're really thinking about feedback we've already heard from the community and what research really shows about transit, which is that we need to make sure transit is frequent, reliable, and goes where people need it to. And as a growing community, we'll need to work really closely with our transit providers to make sure that transit remains a viable option for our residents and workers, including leveraging programs like the Via Rideshare service to connect residents to higher frequency routes. And what are mobility hubs? When we talk about creating mobility hubs, what we really mean is creating a menu of transportation choices for community members and then strategically locating them to be easy to access and easy to connect to other parts of town or other parts of our region. And so as you can see in this example image on your screen, features of a mobility hub can range widely to include transit services, shared mobility services like car share, bike share, or scooter share, as well as personal automobiles, bikes, or other devices, or other options that we haven't thought of yet. But it also includes infrastructure that makes it safer and more convenient to choose these options, whether that means things like separated bike lanes or more parking for bike share services, dedicated curb space for rideshare pickup and drop off, easier to read wayfinding signs, or EV charging stations. And this can also include exploring new trends and technologies that may appear more as digital infrastructure, such as real-time information for bus arrivals, Wi-Fi at hubs or on transit itself, universal payment accounts that can allow you to book a trip using different modes all in one platform, or building sensors and detectors into vehicles and infrastructure to help prevent accidents and improve safety for all road users. Identifying locations for these hubs and the types of features and mobility options that should be included at them are going to be a really important outcome of the Mobility Action Plan that we'll be continuing to seek your input on to make sure that these hubs are tailored to each community's needs. But that is enough from me, so now we want to hear from you. At this time, I'm going to pass it over to Christina with WSP to lead some polling questions accompanied by some facts and concepts that will be further explored by the map. And you'll have about 30 seconds to answer the poll questions as they are popping up on your screen here. But don't worry, because you can always provide additional feedback or submit questions in the chat box at any time. So please go ahead and take your first poll question, and I'll be passing it over to Christina to continue. All right, it looks like our responses are in.
Great. Thanks, Sarah. And again, thanks everyone for attending. I'm excited to talk to you a little bit today about some of our early looks at the existing network and how people are using services today in West Sacramento. So the first step in this project is to take a look at services as they relate to the community and better understand what mobility gaps might be present. It serves as a basis for developing a plan to make sure we're providing the right services in the right area to make sure people can get where they need to go in the most efficient and convenient way possible, and ideally not in a single occupancy vehicle. The project is happening at kind of an interesting time in that the data that we used, which was current at the time it was accessed, may no longer reflect what we're actually seeing today on the ground. But with that said, it does provide a really helpful baseline for us to build on and create goals to make service better than what it was as a recovery develops and begins to happen. So we know that services weren't necessarily working ideally or in the best way that they could for people before. So we know that we want things to change, and we know what we need to do to make services better. So, we've reviewed all modes that currently operate in the city, YOLO bus, VIA, and all the active modes that Sarah mentioned, as well as looked into considerations regarding safety issues surrounding vehicular travel and its relationship to bikes and pedestrians. So for transit, we found citywide that the transit system is relatively underutilized outside of routes that serve downtown Sacramento or Davis, which is kind of interesting because about 70% of residents live within a 5-minute walk of a bus stop that exists. But looking more at the data, only 2% of people, for instance, commute to their place of work by bus. So in its current design, the system appears to not serve the city's residents as effectively as it could for trips wholly within the city. Low frequency or inconsistent service spans might be the driving forces there. Services like high capacity routes or services could potentially make transit more appealing to folks that traditionally would utilize their cars. But also land use patterns play a role in this, where more suburban development like that in the southern area of the city can be more challenging to serve with transit and result in higher vehicle ownership rates. And VIA specifically is an interesting service in the city and is particularly popular amongst seniors given its flexibility and more direct access to some destinations. Things like shopping, for instance, can be much easier for folks. Others have been using it to access YOLO bus, showing its value as a first last mile service from neighborhoods where maybe there isn't good service, or for residents who might not be as able-bodied to complete the trip to the stop through foot or bike. So as you can see from the map on the right, the red circular areas show the areas with the greatest activity on VIA services. And they happen to occur along major corridors that include transit service, commercial services, and educational services. So we're going to do another poll here related to public transit. Okay, and we will move on to another poll that is related to VIA service.
All right, thanks everyone for answering the poll.
Great, thank you. So the city has really done a lot, as Sarah had touched on before, to improve and strengthen the current bicycle and pedestrian connectivity in the city, which is important now more than ever, as usage on these modes has increased since shelter in place has been a part of our lives. And we're seeing it for both recreation and other trips. Usage data prior to for both shared mobility services like Jump, as well as personal bike and pedestrian activity, shows greater activity in the northern portion of the city. So that's what we're considering north of the Deepwater Ship Channel. It's not entirely surprising given the lack of connections across the river in the southern portion of the city, as well as the suburban development patterns, which again can provide fewer direct routes to services or connection points where people might want to go. Interestingly, one thing we found was that the vast majority of residents, when we looked at commute data, have short distance commutes, with a significant proportion working within 5 miles of the city. So with a robust and complete bicycle and pedestrian network, along with safety improvements where needed, this is something that could be leveraged through this plan to encourage more folks to ride or walk if they're able. So we are going to move to another poll question for you all about active transportation and how you're using services.
And we'll wait just a couple more seconds for people to get a final response in here. All right, thanks everyone.
Great. So now that we've looked at the majority of the services available in the city, what do we do with it? How do we expand mobility in West Sacramento? So in order to increase the use of modes other than a personal auto, it's important to strengthen the bus system, but it's also important at the same time to recognize that there are other complementary services that may also be successful in meeting established climate goals that Sarah mentioned earlier, or even personal goals to increase health. Given the changes we're seeing, other services may be better suited in both the long term and short term for shorter trips or linkages to bus services, as providing public transit as we traditionally think about it can be a costly endeavor, especially for cities or whoever is the operator. So I think it's important to note here that we do have to recognize the travel patterns have changed as a result of COVID, and it's unknown whether these are permanent or not, or at least to what extent a segment of the population will no longer be as reliant on cars as they were maybe 6 months ago. What we've seen over the last decade or more in West Sacramento and nearly every area of California or the nation is that we have become increasingly car-centric. And as a result, our plans focused on shifting commuters primarily. But now with many people able to stay at home for work, we definitely need to rethink who we're trying to serve, for what purposes, and with what services. The transportation landscape is changing daily, from patterns that people are making to services available to technology. So there's a lot of room to adapt and grow alongside all of these changes. And now we're going to do another poll about mobility options and what might be available to everyone.
All right, a couple more seconds to get your answers in, and we'll wrap this poll up. All right, thanks everyone.
Great. So with mobility hubs, what we've touched on a few times before this, they're not just about transit or transportation, but they're equally about land use as well. The map that's on the screen on the right shows what the current land use distributions are and concentrations are within the city. And the areas that are darker than the rest of the map are actually where there's a concentration of transportation activity, and it's not specific to a mode. And what we saw was that most of the activity, or the strongest levels of activity, are occurring where there are commercial developments, multifamily residential developments, and educational institutions, which is really promising because that means that people are kind of going to where the services are, and we might be able to get people there through different modes. So the city has a really diverse development pattern that has presented challenges in providing effective mobility options for residents, although VIA and the improvements in the bicycle and pedestrian networks have absolutely helped with this. The inconsistency in patterns in the north, which has more density and transit supportive uses or patterns, can sustain a different level of service and frequency than the south in general, which is dominated by autocentric road networks and lower density developments. The lack of connections in the south is also something that can't be ignored, and it really doesn't make mobility for residents in that area much easier. The good news here that I think is very important to point out is that the city has done a lot to continue promoting and developing transit supportive land uses, and it can be leveraged here. The other good news is that the city is also extremely focused, supportive, and dedicated at the leadership level to think innovatively and with respect to improvements. So this means finding new services that are emerging or employing technology in new ways to support mobility. And we have another poll question here that's more related to uses that you might find at a mobility hub that could potentially make use of the mobility hubs easier for folks, depending on what their trip purpose is.
All right, just a couple more seconds left on the poll here. All right, thank you, everyone.
Great. And we have another poll question, and this relates more to technology and technology-based services that you might be able to take advantage of at a mobility hub.
All right, looks like we have a good amount of answers in. Thanks.
Great. And so last but definitely not least, we do need to talk about equity and address equity. So this is really at the heart of this project. We want to make sure that all residents have equal access and equal opportunity to mobility services. And this definitely is not a one-size-fits-all approach. We want to make sure that, for example, there's different services that are available at off-peak periods, so outside of the traditional commute time, because we recognize that not everybody works a 9-to-5 job and might need services at different times. Obviously affordable, and as part of that, also a fare payment system or some mechanism for fares that might make access easier. Again, connections between modes, and technology that might make access or use of services easier for folks that might be hearing or sight impaired, or where English might not be their native language. So as we start to develop this plan and get through it more, we will have goals and framework that relates to equity that we will be measuring against as we start to develop solutions and recommendations. So really want to make sure that this is a plan for everyone in the city of West Sacramento and not just tailored to one group. And kind of tied to that, as part of equity, one of the things that we did do when we were looking at the existing services was we kind of divided up the city into neighborhoods so that we could really dive in at a deeper level and see where there might be gaps, but also opportunities at not just the citywide level, but really at the heart of where folks are located. And as part of that, we did look at equity issues that might be present at that level so that we are addressing it more granular than just as the city itself. So our last poll question here is related to equity. And if, just to make one point of clarification on the question, communities of concern or vulnerable populations are those that we might consider to potentially be disadvantaged, whether it be income or race or gender or age, or exposed to greater amounts of pollution. There's a whole host of factors that we consider there.
All right, thank you, everyone.
Great. And I'm going to pass it back over to Sarah. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Christina. And thank you, everyone, for participating in the polling questions and listening to us today. I do want to remind you these polling questions are not the end all be all of all of the extensive ideas that may exist. And it's really just a starting point for a conversation. And we hope that the presentation has gotten you excited about thinking about the future of transportation in West Sacramento, and that you'll continue to stay involved in this map effort in the coming months. In terms of what to expect from here, the MAP team is going to be continuing to work on developing criteria for recommending mobility hub locations throughout the city, as well as new mobility options and technologies that the city might want to explore further. We'll be holding some more events in the coming months to share some of those ideas and recommendations and to get your thoughts. So please stay tuned for more event announcements this fall. From there, the team will be compiling a final map document with a set of prioritized recommendations for the City Council to consider implementing. And with our City Council's approval, hopefully towards the end of the year, we would be able to begin work toward identifying resources such as grant funds or otherwise to actually help with implementation of some of the top priority recommendations that come out of this process. So with that, I would like to advance to the next slide, and we can go ahead and open the floor up to any questions or comments you'd like to submit at this time. We'll take a moment to allow folks to submit their questions and kind of think on the information that you just received. But also remember that if your question doesn't get answered now, we'll also be able to post answers to the common questions we receive about the map to the project webpage following the event, and you can always email staff directly as well, as I'll be providing my contact information shortly. All right, well, I have a couple of questions here, but please don't be shy and let us know if you have comments or ideas you want to throw out there, happy to receive those as well. But one question we have received is, what about switching to electric vehicles for city use? And how about electric buses for schools? And this is a great point to bring up. The plug-in partnership that I mentioned earlier is something that we'll be working concurrently alongside as part of the Mobility Action Plan. Incorporating electric vehicle charging stations at mobility hubs can be a really helpful way to not only incentivize personal purchase of electric vehicles, but it can also make it easier for other fleets, whether that's the city or other local businesses, to start transitioning their vehicles over to electric. I believe Washington Unified School District has actually taken some steps to begin electrifying their school buses outside of the scope of the city. And the city is taking steps to invest in infrastructure and begin to electrify its own fleets where possible. We'll check if folks have any more questions coming in here. I'll give another minute. And so we have a couple of questions that have expressed interest in bringing light rail to West Sacramento or even out to the Sacramento airport. Light rail is currently operated by SAC-RT, and there have been some discussions about making those types of extensions. And to the extent that we can incorporate those plans into how we're considering our local mobility network into the future, we'll certainly be doing that. As I mentioned earlier, our staff continues to work with the City of Sacramento on a downtown riverfront streetcar, which would connect rail over into West Sacramento. But these are the types of ideas that we would love to hear more from the community about, of not just the next 10 years or 20 years, but the big picture far out into the future as we continue to develop as a city. How would you envision your community? And is rail a part of that future the way that you envision it? So I would love to hear from our community members, either in our chat box here or by email after this, if you see that as an important part of our mobility future. I'll check if we have some more questions here. We've another question that asks to please speak about improvements to the crossing south of the barge canal. I'm not sure if this question is, I'm assuming this question is related to active transportation potentially, as the barge canal has been identified as a pretty big barrier for bikes and pedestrians. And I'm going to focus on plans for our Sycamore Trail that many community members may have seen the first phase constructed in the north part of the city, which is a fully separated bike and pedestrian trail, which has a second phase that will be going into construction in the next year to overcome the barrier of Highway 50 in town, and would have future phases that continue south and cross the barge canal to enable more community members to more seamlessly and more safely travel on bike and on foot. That is part of our existing bicycle, pedestrian, and trails plan, and is an important project that the city would be continuing to pursue funding for implementation of in the future, and by proxy is incorporated into the considerations of the map. We've another active transportation question here, asking about bicycle infrastructure from Southport and Old West Sacramento to Tower Bridge. Our bicycle, pedestrian, and trails plan, which is available on our webpage, highlights where planned infrastructure is to be located that would help with some of those connections. However, I do want to revisit the concept I introduced earlier that, you know, many of these plans were developed prior to some of these new mobility options that we're seeing emerge and prior to the spike in use of these facilities that we've seen. So where community members may see gaps, whether we're planning for addressing those gaps or not, this is the type of feedback we would love to hear from you. I'm seeing another comment come through about active transportation. So a question asked to please talk about the development of safer bike lanes. I think this goes hand in hand with what I was just speaking about. The city does have an existing 2018 bicycle, pedestrian, and trails master plan that did a lot of work to reach out to the community to identify where we do have existing gaps in our infrastructure. And in terms of developing safer bike lanes, this is going to be really critical if we are going to be able to achieve the very ambitious goals that are set forth by the Mayor's Commission on Climate Change and our forthcoming climate action plan. And as we start to think about the future, we want to hear from the community about, are we going far enough? Do we need to be even bolder in how we provide separated and safe and accommodating bike lanes, the type of bike infrastructure that you would feel comfortable riding on with your family? And we've done a lot of work to identify really key locations for improvements, such as the Sycamore Trail that was mentioned, extensions of the Clarksburg Branch Line Trail, continuations of the Riverfront Riverwalk Trail. But as we think further into the future, as our city continues to develop, these are exactly the types of conversations we'll want to hear from our community members about. Are there other intercity trips or connections that we should be focused on that would make it easier for you to choose hopping on a bicycle for a trip rather than making that trip in a single occupancy vehicle? I'll see what other questions have come in. So a broader question that we may have touched on a bit in the presentation, but happy to touch on again. What mobility applications would serve to reduce vehicle miles traveled or associated greenhouse gas emissions the most? This is a great question that ties back in with our Mayor's Commission on Climate Change goals, which is the framework for our mobility action plan very well. And I'll return to the three kind of categories that we discussed earlier of active transportation, which human-powered transportation is by far the lowest emitting form of transportation. So the more that we can do to support residents in walking, biking, skateboarding, using wheelchairs, that would definitely help to reduce our VMT and associated GHG emissions. But also, we realized that that doesn't work for every type of trip, whether you're trying to do multiple stops along the way, dropping kids off at school and getting to work, or hitting the grocery store on the way back. And where possible, we also want to make sure we're providing options for people to share their rides. So again, that can include things like riding the bus, which we hope to see increasingly electrified transit options, taking via rideshare, or even just carpooling. To reduce the amount of miles that get put on your car. And then lastly, shifting to alternative fuels for where the VMT, the vehicle miles traveled, may not be avoidable, at least doing so using clean fuels that will not create emissions that are contributing to climate change. So it looks like there may be also a question about what types of alternative modes could be planned for the southern areas of West Sacramento. And I think that's a really great question, because every neighborhood in our city, it will need mobility hubs and mobility options that are tailored to their needs. And a lot of that has to do with the development layout of your neighborhood and how far of a distance you would have to cover either on foot or on bike, or how long it would take for you to wait on the bus to get to your final destination. And in the south half of the city, we do have a more spread out land use where residents have both reported through their own feedback as well as shown us in ridership numbers that riding a fixed route bus doesn't always work the best because of things like long wait time or difficulty accessing a bus stop. And as we've started to see increased mode options like bike share or scooter share or via, these are things that we would hope to strategically locate in parts of Southport to make it easier for folks to either use those modes to complete their whole trip, or even make it easier for them to connect to more enhanced transit services that are more direct and higher frequency and shorter travel time. But again, as we think further out into the future, we want to hear from our community members about what types of other options that we may not be thinking about, or other types of connections that you would like to see that you would use as an alternative to driving, or what is preventing you from using those today. And I know one big concern we have heard from community members is the availability of bike share and scooter share services in the southern neighborhoods of town. And so these are things that the city is definitely aware of and working towards, and your feedback will only further help us to develop those recommendations. And I'll take this one last question I'm seeing here. If anyone has any final questions, please get them in now and I might be able to fit it in. But last but not least, how is the city factoring in telework? I think this is, I'll interpret this question in two ways, both from the internal city perspective as well as more broadly. But I can say, as an employer, our city has definitely been taking steps to explore new policies to be flexible with telework during the unusual times that we're in. But more broadly, the city has had longstanding transportation demand management strategies and programs that we have sought to work with major employers locally on. And what I mean when I say transportation demand management is really about identifying these different types of mode options or creating more flexibility in employer policies that allow folks to travel either during off-peak times or work from home more often, so that we can reduce traffic on our local road network and reduce associated emissions, air pollution, and create less need to, accommodate those demands by spreading it out or just reducing it overall. And due to the major impacts of the pandemic, the city is not alone in reconsidering policies around telework, and we'll have to be closely monitoring how this impacts not just us, but other major employers in West Sacramento, whether it's CalSTRS or the Ziggurat or others, as this could fundamentally shift travel patterns and choices as we've observed them in the past, and could really help make some big progress towards our really very ambitious climate goals. Even if folks continued to telework just one day a week, that could have significant positive benefits for reducing demand on roads and reducing emissions associated with driving. And it looks like we did get one last question squeezed in here, so I'll answer this one and then we'll transition to wrap up. And so the last question asks about public spaces as they relate to alternative or active modes. For example, grocery stores within walking distance of all residences. So I think what this question is really getting at is the difference between mobility and access. And mobility really is a means to the end of improving access for folks. Because as I said earlier, transportation is not just about getting people from point A to point B. It's really about improving quality of life and making sure that folks have access to their daily needs. And so while we will be focused on identifying these important locations for mobility hubs and the modes that can connect people between points, the end goal is really about making it easier for folks to access opportunity through jobs or through education, or make it easier to get to the grocery store or medical appointments or to the pharmacy, or even, you know, after school jobs or recreation. But ultimately, in order to make West Sacramento a great place to live in the future, we want to make sure that transportation is not the barrier to accessing those things. So with that, we'll get back to the final slide on our PowerPoint and let you guys know a little bit more information about how you can stay tuned into this project. So again, there will be a survey coming out. We hope that this conversation has given you a lot to think about and maybe sparked some different ideas. And we'll be advertising this community survey in order to help capture some of those ideas that you might have. So please take the survey. This presentation, it has been recorded, so we'll be sharing this to our project webpage, and we hope that you'll share it to your friends, your neighbors, anyone else that you think might be interested or have ideas about how they want to shape the future of transportation in West Sacramento. You can follow the city on social media if you don't already, and then again, just stay tuned for future community workshops that we'll be letting you all know about. So again, we are so appreciative for everyone's participation and time today. My email is on the screen, sarah.s@cityofwestsacramento.org. If you have any additional questions or ideas you'd like to share. And with that, we'll wrap it up. Stay well, and we hope to see you all at the next MAP event. Good evening, everyone.